The air inside the slaughterhouse was thick with the smell of iron and wet straw. It was 6:30 in the evening, and the last light of day had long abandoned the narrow street. Inside, the stone walls were slick with moisture, and the floor was dark with old stains that no amount of scrubbing could lift. 7 men stood in the dim glow of oil lamps, their sleeves rolled to the elbows, their hands marked by the day's work. The sound of their voices carried through the cold space, low and casual as men speak when the labour is nearly done. Outside, the fog had begun to settle over Denham, curling through the alleyways like something alive. A dog barked once, then fell silent. The door to the slaughterhouse stood ajar, and through it came the faint echo of footsteps on cobblestone. No one looked up. No one heard the latch lift. And when the figure stepped inside, it was not with hurry, but with the slow, deliberate motion of someone who had come with purpose. The first man turned his head. The second reached for a knife on the cutting table, and in that instant the air seemed to change, as though the room itself had drawn a breath and forgotten to release it. Chapter 1. The Slaughterhouse on Chapel Street. Good evening, and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night around you is quiet now, the world drawn small and still. Wherever you are listening from, whatever hour marks your clock, know that you have arrived at a place of refuge from the hurried day. Here, in this gentle darkness, we turn our gaze backward through the long corridor of time toward those moments when history held its breath and the world grew cold. I invite you to settle deeply now, to let your shoulders fall and your breath slow, and if you find comfort in these whispered chronicles from the past, if this voice becomes a familiar companion in your night, I ask that you subscribe to this channel so that we may continue these journeys together through the shadowed halls of what once was. Now, let us begin. Let us drift toward a November evening in the year 1870 to a village in Buckinghamshire where the fog lay thick and the stones ran red. The town of Denham sat quiet in the Thames Valley, a place of modest commerce and ancient roots, where the parish church of St. Mary the Virgin had watched over souls since the time of the Normans. The village stretched along the old coaching road between London and Oxford, its cottages built of flint and brick, their windows small and their chimneys tall. In the centre of the settlement stood Chapel Street, a narrow lane that curved past the George Inn and the blacksmith's forge, past the saddler's shop and the grocer's storefront, and ended at a low stone building with heavy wooden doors and no windows facing the road. This was the slaughterhouse, and it had stood there for 30 years, performing the necessary work that fed the village and the neighbouring farms. The building itself was unremarkable in appearance. Its walls were thick Cotswold stone laid without decoration or ornament, and its roof was slate that had darkened with age and weather. The entrance faced away from the main thoroughfare, opening instead onto a small yard where livestock could be herded without disturbing the sensibilities of passers-by. Inside, the space was divided into 3 rooms, the main killing floor where the work was done, a smaller chamber for hanging and bleeding the carcasses, and a 3rd room where the offal was collected and the hides were scraped clean. The floors were paved with stone that sloped toward iron drains, and the walls were whitewashed each spring, though by autumn they always bore the brown stains that no lime could disguise. The men who worked there knew the rhythm of the trade as intimately as they knew the names of their children. They understood that cattle must be driven calmly, that a frightened animal produced tougher meat, that the blade must be sharp enough to part flesh in a single motion, that blood must flow freely or the meat would spoil. They knew the weight of a cleaver, the angle of a hook, the precise moment when a carcass could be moved from one room to the next. This knowledge had been passed from father to son, from master to apprentice, across generations who had learned that slaughter was neither cruel nor kind, but simply necessary, and that it must be done with skill and swiftness or not at all. The slaughterhouse operated 6 days each week, closing only on the Sabbath when the church bells called the faithful to prayer, and the village observed the Lord's Day of Rest. On Mondays and Thursdays, farmers brought their cattle and swine from the surrounding countryside, leading them along the muddy lanes to the yard behind Chapel Street where negotiations were made and prices agreed upon. The animals were kept in pens overnight, given water but no feed so that their stomachs would be empty for the work ahead. At dawn, the killing began. By midday, the carcasses hung in rows, and by evening the butchers had divided the meat for distribution to the shops and taverns of Denham and the estates beyond. November in that year had come cold and wet. The fields lay fallow, the harvest long gathered, and the trees stood bare against skies that remained grey from morning until night. Fog rolled in from the Thames each evening, settling into the low places, filling the lanes and gardens with a dampness that crept through wool and brick alike. Lamps were lit early, and fires were built high, and men hurried home before full darkness fell. It was not a season that invited lingering, not a time when neighbours stood in doorways sharing gossip or children played in the streets until their mothers called them in. It was a season of closed doors and drawn curtains, of early suppers and long nights. On the 23rd day of that November, a Wednesday, the slaughterhouse had received a delivery of 7 head of cattle from a farm in Gerrard's Cross. The animals had been driven along the high road, their breath steaming in the cold air, their hooves churning the mud. They arrived at mid-morning and were penned in the yard, where they stood in restless clusters, shifting their weight and lowing softly to one another. The work of slaughter had been completed by early afternoon, and the carcasses had been dressed and quartered, the blood washed from the stones, the tools cleaned and hung upon their hooks. By 4 o'clock most of the men had departed, returning to their homes or moving on to other employment. But 7 remained, tasked with the final work of the day. These 7 had gathered in the main chamber as the light began to fail. They wore the clothes of their trade, heavy canvas aprons, stained dark woolen shirts with sleeves rolled past the elbow, leather boots that reached to mid-calf. Their hands bore the marks of their labour, scarred and calloused, the fingernails permanently darkened. They were men of varying ages, from youth to middle years, but all shared the particular look of those who worked with their bodies, whose strength was their currency, whose endurance was tested daily. They spoke little as they moved about their tasks, for the work was familiar and required no discussion. One man sharpened knives against a whetstone, the rhythmic scraping filling the space. Another carried buckets of water from the pump in the yard, sluicing the remaining blood toward the drains. A third inspected the hanging meat, checking for any signs of spoilage or improper bleeding. The lamps had been lit as the afternoon dimmed, their flames casting long shadows across the stone walls. The smell of the place was overwhelming to those unaccustomed to it. The metallic tang of blood, the earthy scent of offal, the sharper note of lye soap, and beneath it all the ancient smell of stone that had absorbed decades of death. But to the men who worked there, it was simply the smell of their livelihood. No more remarkable than the scent of bread to a baker or ink to a clerk. Outside, the fog had begun its nightly descent. It moved through Chapel Street like something with intention, obscuring the familiar landmarks, muffling sound, transforming the ordinary into something strange. The lamplighter made his rounds, touching flame to wick along the main road, but the side lanes remained dark and the yard behind the slaughterhouse was lost in grey obscurity. No moon would rise that night, for the clouds hung low and thick, and the darkness would be complete. Inside the stone building, the 7 men continued their work, unaware that the evening had turned, unaware that footsteps approached through the fog, unaware that within the hour their names would be written into the history of Denham in letters that would never fade. The eldest among them was humming softly, an old hymn from his childhood. The youngest was wondering what his wife had prepared for supper. Another was calculating whether he could afford new boots before winter deepened. They were ordinary thoughts, the quiet concerns of ordinary men, who believed they would finish their work and walk home through the fog and sit by their fires and rise again the next morning to do it all once more. The door to the slaughterhouse stood slightly ajar, as it often did when men were working, to allow the circulation of air and the escape of steam. Through that opening came the sounds of the village settling into evening, a dog barking somewhere down Chapel Street, the creak of a wagon passing on the high road, the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer striking one final time before he banked his forge. These sounds were the music of Denham, the familiar chorus that marked the rhythm of days and seasons. And into that music came another sound, so soft at first that no one noticed. The careful tread of boots on cobblestone approaching through the gathering darkness. Chapter 2. The Blood Trade. The business of slaughter in Victorian England was neither romantic nor secret, but it was essential, and it occupied a peculiar place in the social order of village life. Every settlement of sufficient size maintained at least one slaughterhouse, and the men who worked within its walls were regarded with a mixture of necessity and unease. They provided what every household required, yet their labour was conducted behind closed doors, away from the eyes of those who would eat the results but preferred not to witness the process. It was work that connected the pastoral fields where cattle grazed to the dining tables where roasted beef was served, and the men who performed this transformation understood that their role was vital, even if it was rarely acknowledged with gratitude or respect. The trade itself was ancient, as old as the first settlements where humans gathered in numbers too large to hunt wild game. In England, the practice had been regulated since medieval times, when guilds controlled who might butcher animals and where such work could be conducted. By the 19th century, those old guild systems had largely dissolved, but the essential structure remained. A man learned the trade through apprenticeship, beginning in boyhood, watching and assisting until his hands knew the work without conscious thought. He learned which cuts were valuable and which were not, how to judge the health of an animal before purchase, how to negotiate with farmers and satisfy the demands of customers who knew good meat from poor. The slaughterhouse on Chapel Street in Denham served at a radius of perhaps 5 miles, drawing livestock from the farms that dotted the Thames Valley and supplying meat to the village shops, the coaching inns, the private estates, and the households of the gentry who maintained country residences in the area. The volume of work varied with the seasons. In autumn, when animals were culled before winter feeding became necessary, the killing floor operated at full capacity, processing dozens of cattle and swine each week. In spring, when livestock were lean from winter and new grass had not yet fattened them, the work slowed, and the men found other employment or subsisted on what they had saved during the busier months. The financial arrangements were straightforward but precarious. Farmers brought their animals to market and the slaughtermen purchased them outright, assuming the risk that the meat would sell before it spoiled. The price paid to the farmer depended on weight, condition, and the current demand in London, where the Great Smithfield Market set rates that rippled outward to every provincial town and village. A good week might yield enough profit to support a family comfortably. A poor week, when meat failed to sell or an animal proved diseased after slaughter, could mean debt and hardship. There was no steady wage, no guarantee of income, only the daily gamble of commerce and the hope that skill and reputation would attract sufficient business to sustain life. The tools of the trade were simple but specific. A slaughterman owned his knives, and he cared for them with the attention a carpenter gave to his planes, or a seamstress to her needles. The primary blade was heavy and broad, designed for the initial cut that severed the great vessels of the neck and allowed the blood to drain. Secondary knives were smaller and more precise, used for sinning and sectioning the carcass into portions. Cleavers split bone, hooks suspended meat from iron rails, chains and pulleys lifted weight that no man could manage alone. These tools were expensive to purchase and time-consuming to maintain, but without them the work could not be done. A dull knife meant ragged cuts and wasted meat. A broken chain meant injury or death. The men who worked in the slaughterhouse understood that their tools were extensions of their bodies, and they treated them accordingly. The process of slaughter followed a sequence that had been refined over centuries. The animal was led from the pen into the killing room, ideally calm and unsuspecting. A blow to the head with a heavy mallet rendered it insensible, and immediately the knife opened the throat, cutting deep through hide and muscle to sever the carotid arteries and jugular veins. Blood poured onto the sloped stone floor and ran toward the drains, thick and dark and steaming in cold weather. The animal collapsed, its legs jerking in the involuntary spasms of dying, and the men waited until the movement ceased and the blood flow slowed to a trickle. Then the carcass was hoisted by its hind legs, suspended from the rails, and the work of butchery began. The hide was removed first, peeled away with careful knife work that separated skin from flesh without damaging either. Hides were valuable, sold to tanners who would transform them into leather for boots and harnesses and saddlery. The head was severed and set aside. The tongue and brains and cheeks salvaged for those who valued such delicacies. The belly was opened, and the organs were extracted, the heart and liver and kidneys destined for sale, the intestines cleaned and prepared for sausage casings, the stomach and lesser organs discarded or rendered for tallow. What remained was the meat itself, the muscle and fat that would be divided into recognizable cuts, the loin and ribs, the shoulder and leg, the brisket and flank. Every part of the animal was used, for waste meant lost profit, and the Victorian economy was not generous to those who squandered resources. Bones were sold to button makers and fertilizer manufacturers. Blood was collected and given to farmers as enrichment for their fields. Fat was rendered into tallow for candles and soap. Even the hooves were boiled down for glue. Nothing was without value if one knew where to sell it, and the successful slaughtermen maintained relationships with tanners and renderers and bone merchants, ensuring that every portion of every animal found a buyer. The men who performed this work came from families that had been in the trade for generations, or they were drawn to it because other opportunities had closed to them. It was not employment that attracted the ambitious or the educated, for the work was hard and the social standing low. Butchers and slaughtermen were not invited to dine with merchants and solicitors. Their daughters did not marry into shopkeeping families. Their sons were expected to follow their fathers into the same occupation, perpetuating a kind of informal caste that existed within the broader working class. Yet there was pride in the work, the pride of skill mastered and service provided. A good slaughterman could judge an animal's weight to within a few pounds by eye alone. He could skin a carcass in minutes without marring the hide. He knew the difference between meat that would keep for days and meat that must be sold immediately. This knowledge was not written in books or taught in schools, but it was knowledge nonetheless, earned through years of labour and observation. The slaughterhouse itself was subject to certain regulations, though enforcement was inconsistent and often depended on the complaints of neighbours rather than the vigilance of authorities. The building was supposed to be kept clean, with regular washing of floors and walls. Blood was not to be allowed to accumulate in the drains, lest it rot and produce noxious vapours. The work was not to be conducted on Sundays or during hours when it might disturb the peace of the community. Animals were supposed to be rendered insensible before slaughter, a provision intended to prevent unnecessary suffering, though in practice the speed and efficiency of the work often took precedence over such considerations. Inspectors occasionally appeared to examine the premises and ensure compliance, but their visits were infrequent and easily anticipated, giving the men time to make whatever adjustments were necessary to avoid fines or closure. The relationship between the slaughterhouse and the community was complex. Everyone needed meat, yet no one wished to live adjacent to the place where animals died. The smell alone was sufficient to lower property values, and complaints were common when the wind carried the scent of blood and offal into the gardens and parlours of respectable homes. But relocation was expensive and often opposed by those who had become the new neighbours, so the slaughterhouses remained where they had always been, tolerated as necessary evils, their workers acknowledged with curt nods but rarely with warmth. On that November evening in 1870, the 7 men in the Chapel Street slaughterhouse were engaged in the final tasks of a long day. The cattle had been processed, the meat hung, the blood washed away. What remained was the cleaning of tools, the inspection of tomorrow's work, the small administrative details that marked the transition from labour to rest. They moved through these tasks with the efficiency of long practice, each man attending to his responsibilities without need for instruction or supervision. The eldest among them, a man named Thomas Hartwell, oversaw the work with the quiet authority of experience. He had been a slaughterman for 35 years, since the age of 12, and there was little about the trade that he had not seen or done. His hands were gnarled with arthritis, his back bent from decades of lifting, but his eyes remained sharp and his judgment sound. The others deferred to him not because he demanded deference, but because he had earned it through competence and fairness. He did not ask any man to do work he would not do himself. He divided the profits equitably. He extended credit when times were hard and did not shame those who struggled. In return, the men gave him their labour and their loyalty. And the slaughterhouse operated smoothly because everyone understood their role and performed it without resentment. As the lamps burned and the fog thickened outside, none of them could have known that the blood trade they practiced would soon become something else entirely, that the tools they used to slaughter cattle would be turned to a different purpose, that the stone floor they had washed clean would be marked with stains that no water could remove. They worked in the present moment, concerned only with the tasks before them, unaware that history was about to descend upon them like a blade. Chapter 3. The Men of the Yard. Thomas Hartwell had been born in Denham in the year 1823, the son of a carter who hauled goods along the coaching road between London and Oxford. His childhood had been unremarkable, marked by the ordinary hardships of rural poverty, irregular meals, cold winters, the constant proximity of illness and death. At 12, he had been apprenticed to the village slaughterman, a man named Wickham who drank too much and died before Thomas reached his 20th year. Upon Wickham's death, Thomas had assumed operation of the Chapel Street slaughterhouse, taking on the debts and the equipment and the relationships with farmers and butchers that constituted the business. He had married at 22 a woman named Elizabeth who bore him 6 children, 4 of whom survived infancy. By the time of that November evening in 1870, he was 47 years old, his hair grey, his face weathered, his body marked by the accumulated injuries of his trade, a scar across his left palm from a knife that had slipped, a crooked finger broken when a carcass had fallen, a persistent ache in his lower back that worsened in damp weather. He was not a man given to introspection or complaint. He rose each morning before dawn, attended to his work until dusk, returned home to eat whatever Elizabeth had prepared, and slept the heavy sleep of physical exhaustion. On Sundays, he sat in the pew at St. Mary the Virgin, listening to sermons he did not fully understand, but accepting as necessary to the order of things. He did not read books or follow politics or concern himself with the matters beyond the immediate requirements of survival. His world was small and defined by labour, and within that world he functioned with competence and dignity. Beside him in the slaughterhouse that evening stood his eldest son, William Hartwell, aged 24, who had followed his father into the trade as sons had done for generations. William had learned the work from childhood, beginning with simple tasks like carrying water and sweeping floors, progressing to more skilled labour as his strength and judgment developed. He was taller than his father, broader in the shoulders, and possessed of an easy confidence that came from youth and health. He had married the previous year, and his wife was expecting their first child in the spring. William harboured ambitions that his father had never entertained. He spoke of expanding the business, of purchasing a second slaughterhouse in a neighbouring village, of becoming a supplier to the Great Smithfield Market in London. Thomas listened to these plans with patient scepticism, knowing that ambition and capital were different things, and that the latter was far more difficult to acquire than the former. The third man present was James Morton, 31 years old, who had come to Denham from Hertfordshire 5 years earlier, seeking work after his own village had fallen into decline when the coaching trade diminished. He was a skilled butcher, quick with a knife and precise in his cuts, and Thomas had hired him without hesitation. James lived in lodgings above the saddler's shop, sent money each month to his widowed mother, and attended Methodist services on Sundays, a deviation from the Anglican norm that marked him as slightly foreign in the eyes of some villagers. He spoke little of his past, and the other men respected his privacy. In the slaughterhouse, he performed his duties with quiet efficiency, neither seeking friendship nor avoiding it. The fourth man was Edward Palmer, aged 19, the youngest of the group and the most recent addition to their number. He had been apprenticed to Thomas only 8 months earlier, and his skills were still developing. He was the son of a farm labourer from Iver, sent to learn a trade that might lift him slightly above the precarious existence of agricultural work. Edward was eager and attentive, quick to volunteer for the hardest tasks, anxious to prove his worth. He made mistakes that the older men corrected with patience, understanding that mastery required time and repetition. He was engaged to be married to a girl from his home village, and he saved every penny he could spare toward the expenses of setting up a household. The fifth man was Robert Chilton, 40 years old, who had worked with Thomas for 15 years. Robert had a reputation for strength, capable of lifting weights that other men required assistance to move. He was also known for his temper, which could flare unexpectedly when he felt himself insulted or treated unjustly, though he had never directed his anger toward his fellow workers. He lived with his wife and 3 children in a cottage on the edge of the village, and he supplemented his income by taking occasional work as a labourer on the roads or farms. His hands were massive, scarred across the knuckles, and when he gripped a cleaver, it seemed almost small in his palm. The sixth man was Henry Walsh, 36 years old, who had worked in the slaughterhouse for a decade. Henry was meticulous in his habits, insisting that tools be returned to their proper places, that the work area be kept organised, that nothing be left to chance or carelessness. This attention to detail made him valuable, and Thomas relied on him to maintain the standards that ensured the business operated smoothly. Henry had no wife or children, lived alone in rooms near the church, and spent his evenings reading newspapers at the George Inn, where he nursed a single pint of ale and engaged in quiet conversation with the other regulars. He was thought to be educated beyond his station, for he could write in a clear hand and perform calculations in his head, skills that might have led to clerkship or shopkeeping if he had possessed the connections or capital to pursue such paths. The seventh man was Albert Green, 28 years old, who had joined the slaughterhouse work 2 years earlier after an injury ended his career as a bricklayer. A fall from scaffolding had left him with a pronounced limp, and he could no longer perform the climbing and balancing that masonry required, but his upper body remained strong, and he had adapted to the work of slaughter without complaint. Albert was known for his humour, for the jokes and stories he shared during the long hours, and his presence lightened the atmosphere of a place that might otherwise have been oppressive. He had a sweetheart in the village, a seamstress named Catherine, and they planned to marry once he had accumulated sufficient savings. These 7 men gathered in the slaughterhouse on Chapel Street as November darkness fell represented a cross-section of working-class Victorian life. They were neither exceptional nor representative, but simply men who laboured for their bread, who hoped for modest improvements in their circumstances, who carried the ordinary burdens of poverty and toil. They had families who depended on them, debts they struggled to repay, dreams they harboured but did not expect to realise. They knew one another's habits and quirks, had worked shoulder to shoulder through heat and cold, had shared the satisfaction of work well done and the frustration of setbacks beyond their control. They did not know one another's innermost thoughts or deepest fears, for such intimacy was not the custom among working men of their time and place. Their conversations were practical, focused on the tasks at hand, on the price of livestock and the quality of meat, on the weather and the roads and the small events of village life. They did not speak of love or loss, of hope or despair, of the questions that troubled them in the quiet hours before sleep. Such matters were private, held within the individual heart, shared only with wives or confessors or not shared at all. As they moved about their final tasks that evening, they formed a tableau of ordinary labour. Thomas inspecting a side of beef, running his hand along the marbling to assess its quality. William sharpening a knife against the whetstone, testing the edge against his thumb. James carrying a bucket of water from the pump. Edward sweeping the floor with methodical strokes. Robert hanging a cleaver on its designated hook. Henry recording the day's work in a ledger, his pen scratching across the page. Albert making some jest that brought brief smiles to tired faces. The lamps cast their shadows long across the stone walls, and the temperature inside the building had dropped as evening advanced, for there was no heating beyond what residual warmth remained from the day's activity. The men would work perhaps another quarter hour, then extinguish the lamps and secure the doors and walk home through the fog to their separate dwellings, where fires burned and food waited and sleep would come quickly. It was an evening like 100 others, distinguished by nothing except what was about to occur, and in the moment before it did, They were simply 7 men completing their work, unaware that their names would be spoken with horror and pity for generations to come, unaware that the slaughterhouse that had been their place of labour would become their place of death. Chapter 4. The Stranger at the Door. The fog had transformed Denham into a place of uncertain boundaries where familiar landmarks disappeared and reappeared without warning, where sound travelled strangely, muffled in some directions and amplified in others. It was the kind of fog that made even natives uncertain of their path, that turned short distances into journeys of careful navigation. Lamps burned in windows along Chapel Street, their light reduced to faint orange smudges that provided no illumination beyond a few feet. The cobblestones were slick with moisture, and the air carried the smell of coal smoke and damp wool and the River Thames that flowed somewhere beyond the obscured horizon. Through this fog came a figure, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who knew his destination and felt no need to hurry. He wore a long coat of dark wool, his collar turned up against the cold, and a hat pulled low over his forehead. His boots made a steady rhythm against the stones, neither loud nor soft, simply the sound of a man walking. He passed the George Inn, where voices murmured behind fogged windows, and the sign creaked on its chains. He passed the saddler's shop, closed and dark. He passed the forge, where the bank's coal still radiated heat that created a small sphere of warmth in the night air. He turned down the narrow lane that led to the rear of the slaughterhouse, where the yard opened onto a space used for penning livestock. The fog was thicker here, away from the main road, and the darkness was nearly absolute. But he did not stumble or hesitate, suggesting either familiarity with the location or eyes well adjusted to the darkness. His right hand rested in the pocket of his coat, and his left swung freely at his side. His breath created small clouds that dissipated immediately into the surrounding vapour. He made no sound beyond his footsteps, spoke no word, gave no sign of hesitation or doubt. The door to the slaughterhouse stood partially open, as it had throughout the evening, and through that opening spilled a wedge of lamplight and the sounds of men at work. The scrape of a blade being sharpened, the splash of water poured onto stone, the low murmur of conversation. These were the sounds of ordinary labour nearing its conclusion, the familiar music of a workday ending. They suggested nothing of danger or alarm, only the unremarkable conclusion of unremarkable tasks. The figure paused outside the door, standing just beyond the reach of the lamplight, in the space where darkness met illumination, but did not surrender to it. He stood there for perhaps 30 seconds, perhaps a full minute, motionless except for the rise and fall of his breathing. What thoughts occupied his mind in that interval? What emotions moved beneath the surface of his composure? What final calculation or commitment occurred in those moments? No witness would ever record and no evidence would ever reveal. He was simply there, a shape in the darkness, a presence poised at the threshold between two states of being. Inside the slaughterhouse, the 7 men continued their work, unaware that they were being observed, unaware that the evening had reached its critical juncture. Thomas Hartwell had finished his inspection of the meat and was washing his hands in a bucket of cold water. William stood near the doorway, coiling a length of rope that had been used to hoist carcasses. James Morton was arranging knives on their designated shelf, ensuring each blade was clean and positioned for easy retrieval the next morning. Edward Palmer continued sweeping, pushing debris toward the drain in the corner. Robert Chilton was adjusting the chain on one of the pulleys, testing its weight to ensure it would not fail. Henry Walsh had completed his entries in the ledger and was blotting the ink with sand to prevent smudging. Albert Green leaned against the stone wall, tired from the day's labour, waiting for the signal that they could depart. The figure at the door drew his right hand from his pocket. In that hand was an object, though the darkness and the fog made it impossible for any observer to determine its nature with certainty. He tested its weight, shifted his grip, and then stepped forward across the threshold into the lamplight. William Hartwell was the first to notice him. He looked up from the rope he was coiling, his expression shifting from casual attention to mild curiosity. A visitor at this hour was unusual but not unprecedented. Farmers sometimes arrived late with animals they wished to sell, or customers came seeking a particular cut of meat, or neighbours stopped by with messages or requests. William straightened, opened his mouth to offer a greeting, and in that instant the nature of the evening changed. The figure moved with sudden speed, crossing the space between the door and the interior of the slaughterhouse in 3 long strides. The object in his right hand rose and fell, and William staggered backward, his hands moving to his throat, his eyes wide with shock rather than understanding. He collided with the wall behind him and slid downward, leaving a dark smear against the whitewashed stone. The rope fell from his hands and lay coiled on the floor like a sleeping serpent. The other men turned toward the sound of impact, their minds struggling to process what their eyes reported. For a moment, perhaps 2, no one moved. The human mind requires time to adjust from the ordinary to the extraordinary, from the expected to the incomprehensible. They had been concluding their work, anticipating their departure, occupied with familiar tasks and familiar thoughts. And now there was a stranger among them, and William was on the floor. And the air had changed in a way that bypassed rational understanding and spoke directly to the ancient parts of the brain that recognized danger before the conscious mind could name it. Thomas Hartwell spoke first, his voice sharp with confusion and rising alarm. He called out a question, demanding to know who this man was and what business brought him here at such an hour. The figure did not answer. He turned toward Thomas with the same deliberate quality that had marked his approach through the fog, and his arm rose again. What followed happened in a space of minutes that would later be reconstructed from evidence and injury, from the positions of bodies and the patterns of blood, from the testimony of those who heard sounds but saw nothing, and from the cold logic of sequence and causation. There were no witnesses in the conventional sense, no one who stood apart and observed the events unfold from beginning to end. There was only chaos and violence and the desperate struggle of men who found themselves suddenly fighting not for profit or pride, but for the simple continuation of their lives. The slaughterhouse became a place of screaming and collision, of bodies falling and tools grasped as weapons, of lamplight flickering across scenes of horror that would mark the stones with memory. The men who had spent their day dealing death to cattle found themselves subject to the same brutal efficiency they had practiced on animals, and the irony of this reversal would not be lost on those who later contemplated the events. The tools that hung on the walls, the knives and cleavers and hooks, became instruments in a struggle that had no rules and no mercy. The fog outside absorbed the sounds that emerged from the slaughterhouse, muffling them, distorting them, rendering them ambiguous to anyone who might have heard. A shout might have been mistaken for a call between workers, a crash might have been the dropping of heavy equipment. The sounds of violence, when filtered through fog and stone walls, lose their specificity and become simply noise, remarkable only in intensity rather than character. And so the people of Denham, those who sat by their fires in the surrounding houses, heard perhaps something, perhaps nothing, and thought little of it if they noticed at all. Inside the stone building on Chapel Street, 7 men fought and died, and the fog pressed close against the door, and the lamps burned steadily, casting their indifferent light on a scene that would haunt the village for generations to come. Chapter 5. The First to Fall. Thomas Hartwell had survived 47 years through a combination of caution and competence, through the ability to read situations quickly and respond with appropriate action. He had avoided serious injury in a trade where men regularly lost fingers or suffered wounds that turned septic and fatal. He had navigated the economic uncertainties of his business without falling into ruinous debt. He had raised children through the dangers of childhood illness and seen them reach adulthood. His survival was not a matter of luck, but of judgment, and that judgment had been honed through decades of experience with animals and men and the unpredictable nature of both. When the stranger's arm rose toward him, Thomas did what instinct and experience commanded. He stepped sideways, reaching for the nearest object that might serve as defense. His hand closed around the handle of a cleaver that hung from its designated hook on the wall. The weight of it was familiar. the balance known to his palm through countless repetitions. He raised it not with the intention to kill, but with the simple determination to protect himself from an attack he did not understand but could not deny. The stranger was faster than Thomas had anticipated. The blow that had been aimed at Thomas's head struck instead his raised forearm, and Thomas heard the bone crack before he felt the pain. The cleaver fell from his suddenly nerveless fingers and clattered against the stone floor. He stumbled backward, his left hand clutching his damaged right arm, his mind still struggling to comprehend what was occurring. Behind him, he heard William making sounds that were not words but something more primitive, the sounds of a body failing. The stranger advanced without pause, without expression, with the methodical quality of someone performing a task that required completion. His weapon rose and fell again, and this time Thomas had no defence to offer. The blow caught him across the side of his head, above his left ear, and the world exploded into light and then collapsed into darkness. Thomas fell forward onto his hands and knees, blood pouring from the wound, running down his neck and soaking into his collar. He tried to rise, his body responding to the fundamental command to escape, to survive, but his legs would not obey. His vision had narrowed to a tunnel, and at the end of that tunnel was the stone floor, marked with the stains of 1,000 slaughters, and he understood with sudden clarity that his own blood was joining those stains, that the floor he had walked across every day for 35 years would be the last thing he saw. He fell onto his side, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his hands moving without purpose across the stones as though searching for something he had lost. The sounds of the slaughterhouse had changed. Where there had been the ordinary noises of work concluding, now there were shouts and crashes and the terrible sounds of impact, flesh meeting metal, bone breaking, men crying out in pain and fear and desperate confusion. Thomas tried to call out to his son, to William, but his voice emerged as nothing more than a wet gurgle. He could see William's boots from where he lay, could see them motionless near the wall, and he understood what that stillness meant. The pain in his head was enormous, occupying all the sensation, but beneath it was a different kind of pain. The pain of knowing that his son was dead or dying, that the business he had built was ending, that Elizabeth would be widowed and his children fatherless, that everything he had worked for was dissolving in the space of minutes. He had imagined his death many times, as most men did, but he had imagined it arriving through illness or accident or the simple accumulation of years. He had not imagined this, dying on the floor of his own workplace, killed by a stranger for reasons he could not fathom. His vision was darkening at the edges, the tunnel narrowing further, and he could no longer distinguish individual sounds from the chaos around him. Everything was blending together into a single overwhelming noise, and beneath that noise was a deeper silence that was calling to him with increasing insistence. He thought of Elizabeth, of the morning he had met her at the harvest fair in Uxbridge, of the way she had smiled at him when he had asked if he might walk her home. He thought of his children when they were small, before death and disease had claimed 2 of them, when they had all gathered around the table for Sunday dinner, and he had felt something close to contentment. He thought of his father, the carter, who had told him that a man's worth was measured in the work he did and the family he supported, and he hoped that he had measured well, that his life had counted for something beyond the accumulation of days. The darkness was complete now, and the silence had become absolute. Thomas Hartwell's last conscious thought was not of fear or anger, or even pain, but of a peculiar regret that he would not see spring again, would not see the apple trees bloom in his garden, would not see his grandchild who was expected in March. And then even that thought dissolved, and he was gone, the first to fall in a massacre that had barely begun. His body lay on the stones in the position of someone who had tried to rise and failed, one arm extended as though reaching for something beyond his grasp, his face turned toward the door through which he had expected to walk home to his wife and his supper and his bed. Blood pooled beneath him, spreading slowly across the slight slope of the floor toward the drain that had carried away the blood of countless animals. The lamp above him continued to burn steadily, its flame undisturbed by the violence below, casting his shadow long and still against the wall. Across the room, William Hartwell had already ceased breathing. his life ended by the first savage blow that had opened his throat with brutal efficiency. He had died quickly, perhaps without full understanding of what was happening, his body collapsing against the wall before his mind could process the reality of his situation. Father and son lay 15 feet apart, separated by the width of the killing floor, united in death as they had been united in life and labour. Neither would see the morning, neither would return to the homes where their families waited. Neither would hear the church bells that would toll the next day when the news spread through the village. The stranger moved past Thomas's body without looking down, his attention already fixed on the remaining men who were now scrambling for weapons or exits, their shock giving way to the animal desperation of cornered creatures who understood that they were fighting not for victory but for the slim chance of survival. The slaughterhouse had become what it had always been in essence, a place where death was administered with efficiency and without sentiment, where the strong prevailed over the weak, where blood flowed and stained and marked the stones with testimony that could not be erased. Chapter 6. The slaughter begins. James Morton had been in situations of danger before, though never quite like this. In his youth in Hertfordshire, he had once been attacked by a bull that had broken free from its pen, and he had escaped by diving under a fence with the animal's horns inches from his back. He had been caught in a brawl outside a public house when a disagreement over money had escalated into violence, and he had received a black eye and broken nose for his proximity to the conflict. He understood that the world contained threats, that men could be dangerous, that survival sometimes required quick decisions and quicker action. When Thomas Hartwell fell, James was standing near the rear wall of the slaughterhouse, beside the door that led to the smaller chamber where carcasses were hung. His first instinct was to retreat through that door, to put distance and barriers between himself and whatever madness had erupted in the killing room. But as he turned toward the door, he saw that Edward Palmer was already there, fumbling with the latch, his hands shaking so badly that he could not work the simple mechanism that would open it. James reached Edward in 3 strides and pushed the younger man aside with more force than he intended. Edward stumbled and fell, striking his shoulder against the doorframe, and cried out in pain and fear. James got the door open and pulled Edward to his feet, dragging him through into the hanging room beyond. Behind them, the sounds of violence continued. The heavy impact of metal on flesh, the crash of equipment being overturned, the shouts of men in extremity. The hanging room was darker than the killing floor, illuminated by only a single lamp that hung near the far wall. Carcasses suspended from hooks created a forest of dead meat through which James and Edward moved in desperate flight. The air was colder here, and their breath came in visible clouds. James looked around for another exit, but there was none. The only door led back into the killing room they had just fled. They were trapped, cornered in a space designed for dead animals, and the realization of their situation settled on James with the weight of certainty. He turned to the wall, where tools hung on iron hooks, and selected a long knife with a narrow blade, designed for the precise work of separating meat from bone. It was not much of a weapon, but it was better than empty hands. Edward had pressed himself into the corner farthest from the door, his arms wrapped around his head. His body shaking with the force of his terror, James wanted to tell him to stand, to fight, to do something other than cower. But he understood that fear could paralyze a man as completely as any physical injury, and there was no time to coax courage from someone who had none to give. The door through which they had escaped now opened again, slowly, and the stranger entered the hanging room with the same deliberate pace he had maintained throughout. He was silhouetted against the brighter light of the killing room behind him, and James could not see his face clearly, could distinguish no features that might later allow identification. He was simply a shape, a presence, a force that had entered their world and transformed it into nightmare. James called out, his voice steady despite the fear that filled his chest. He demanded to know what the stranger wanted, what grievance had brought him here, whether money would satisfy him, or if there was some other resolution that might end this horror. The stranger did not respond. He crossed the threshold into the hanging room, and began moving between the suspended carcasses, his weapon raised, his attention fixed on James with the single-minded focus of a predator. James backed away, keeping the knife before him in what he hoped was a defensive posture, though he had never fought with a blade and had no training in such matters. His heel struck something on the floor, and he nearly lost his balance. He glanced down and saw a bucket overturned, water spreading across the stones. When he looked up again, the stranger was closer, had closed half the distance between them, while James had been distracted. They came together in the space between two hanging carcasses, in a patch of shadow where the lamplight barely reached. James struck out with his knife, aiming for the stranger's chest, but the blow was awkward and slow, and the stranger deflected it easily with his own weapon. The force of the parry sent James's knife skittering across the floor, and he was suddenly empty-handed, defenceless, with no options remaining except to grapple with his attacker in the desperate hope that strength might succeed where weapons had failed. James was not a small man, and his work had made him strong, but the stranger was stronger, or more skilled, or more determined. They struggled in silence, James trying to grab the stranger's weapon arm, the stranger trying to break free and gain room to strike. They crashed into one of the hanging carcasses, setting it swinging on its chain, and the movement created shifting shadows that made it difficult to judge distance or position. James felt his feet sliding on the wet floor, felt his grip weakening, felt the inevitability of his situation settling over him like a shroud. The stranger broke free of James's grasp and struck twice in rapid succession, each blow delivered with the precision of someone who knew exactly where and how to cut. James felt the impacts as distant sensations, as though they were happening to someone else, and only when he saw the blood spreading across his chest did he understand that he had been mortally wounded. He tried to call out, to warn Edward, to do something with his final seconds, but his lungs would not fill with air, and the only sound that emerged was a wet bubbling that carried no meaning. He fell to his knees, his hands pressed against his chest in the futile attempt to hold his life inside his body. The stranger stepped past him, without pause, and moved toward the corner, where Edward Palmer remained curled into himself, making small sounds of terror that were barely human. James watched as the stranger reached Edward, watched as the younger man tried to scramble away and failed, watched as the weapon rose and fell with mechanical regularity. And then James pitched forward onto his face, and the cold of the stone floor was the last thing he felt before the darkness claimed him. In the killing room, Robert Chiltern had armed himself with a cleaver and was standing near the door to the yard, prepared to defend himself or flee into the fog if opportunity presented. Henry Walsh had overturned one of the heavy wooden tables and was crouched behind it, hoping that the solid oak might stop or slow whatever weapon the stranger carried. Albert Green had been struck during the initial chaos and lay near the centre of the room, conscious but unable to rise, blood pouring from a wound in his leg that had severed some vital vessel. The stranger emerged from the hanging room and surveyed the killing floor with the calm assessment of someone evaluating a partially completed task. 3 men were dead or dying, 4 remained, though one was incapacitated and posed no threat. The mathematics of slaughter were simple. Eliminate resistance, maintain momentum, complete the objective. The stranger moved toward Robert Chiltern, with the same methodical quality that had characterized all his actions, and Robert raised his cleaver and roared defiance, the sound echoing off the stone walls like the battle cry of some ancient warrior facing impossible odds. Chapter 7. The Silence of Witnesses. Chapel Street in the fog was a place of muffled existence, where the ordinary sounds of evening were dampened to near inaudibility. Mrs. Eleanor Ashford sat in her parlour 3 doors down from the slaughterhouse, working on her needlepoint by the light of an oil lamp. She was a widow of 62 years, her husband having died a decade earlier from the pneumonia that carried away so many in the damp Thames Valley winters. Her hearing had deteriorated with age, and the fog made everything more difficult to perceive, but she was accustomed to the peculiar acoustics of such weather. She heard the church clock strike 6:30, heard the distant bark of a dog, heard the creak of her own house settling. If there were sounds from the slaughterhouse, They did not penetrate her awareness as anything worthy of attention. Across the street, George Wickham tended his small shop where he sold tobacco and newspapers and sundry goods to the residents of Denham. At this hour the shop was closed, but George remained in the back room, tallying the day's receipts and preparing his ledger for the accountant who would visit at the end of the month. He was a methodical man who took satisfaction in the orderly arrangement of figures and the balance of accounts. His shop faced away from the slaughterhouse toward the high road, and the sounds that emerged from Chapel Street reached him only as indistinct noise that might have been anything or nothing. He noted them without interest and returned to his calculations. Further along the street, at the George Inn, the evening trade was beginning to gather. Men arrived after their day's labour, seeking the warmth of the common room and the companionship that came with a pint of ale or cider. The innkeeper, Samuel Griggs, moved between tables with practised efficiency, drawing drinks and exchanging the small talk that was expected of his position. The conversation in the room created a constant murmur, punctuated by occasional laughter or the thump of mugs on wooden tables. Whatever sounds emerged from the slaughterhouse were lost in this ambient noise, subsumed into the ordinary soundtrack of village evening life. The Reverend Thomas Whitfield sat in his study at the rectory beside St. Mary the Virgin, preparing his sermon for the coming Sunday. His text was taken from the book of Job, that ancient meditation on suffering and faith, and he struggled to find words that might speak to his congregation without seeming to preach at them. He had been the rector of Denham for 18 years, and he knew his parishioners well enough to understand that they had little patience for elaborate theology or abstract philosophy. They wanted practical guidance for their daily struggles, reassurance that their hardships had meaning, comfort in the face of death and loss. The Reverend Whitfield chewed the end of his pen and stared at the half-written page before him, unaware that within a few hundred yards of where he sat, 7 men were dying in circumstances that would test every theological certainty he possessed. In the small cottage at the end of Chapel Street, Elizabeth Hartwell stirred a pot of stew over the fire, adding carrots and turnips from the garden and a small piece of mutton she had purchased from the butcher that morning. She expected Thomas and William home within the hour, and she had prepared enough food to fill their bellies after their long day of labour. Her younger children were upstairs in their beds, already asleep, for she maintained strict schedules and did not permit them to stay awake past their appointed times. She moved about her kitchen with the efficiency of long practice, setting the table, slicing bread, filling mugs with small beer. Through her window she could see nothing but fog, thick and grey and impenetrable, and she thought briefly of how cold Thomas and William must be at their work. She hoped they would finish soon and come home to warmth and food and rest. Mary Palmer, Edward's mother, sat in her cottage in Yver, unaware that her son would not return to her that night or any night thereafter. She was mending his shirt, repairing a tear in the sleeve, and as she worked, she thought about his upcoming wedding, about the expenses that would be required, about whether they could afford the modest celebration that was customary. Edward was a good son, dutiful and responsible, and she was proud of the man he was becoming. She had worried when he left their village to apprentice in Denham, but the work seemed to suit him, and Thomas Hartwell was known to be a fair master. She pulled the needle through the cloth and smiled at some private thought, secure in the belief that her son was safe and well and would visit her on Sunday as he did every week. In the slaughterhouse, Albert Green tried to drag himself toward the door, leaving a trail of blood across the stones. His leg no longer functioned, the muscles severed or the bone broken, and the pain was extraordinary. But beneath the pain was a more fundamental terror, the understanding that he was going to die unless he could somehow escape. He could see the open door, could see the fog beyond it, could imagine himself reaching the street where someone might hear his calls for help. The distance was perhaps 20 feet, but it might as well have been 20 miles. His strength was draining away with his blood, and each movement required more effort than he could muster. He collapsed halfway to the door and lay there panting, his vision swimming, his hands scrabbling uselessly against the floor. Behind him, he could hear the sounds of continued struggle, Robert Chilton's voice raised in fury and defiance. The clash of metal on metal, the heavy crash of something falling. Albert tried to call out, to beg for mercy or assistance, but his voice emerged as nothing more than a whisper that could not carry beyond the immediate space around his head. The fog pressed against the doorway, tendrils of it creeping into the slaughterhouse like curious fingers exploring a wound. The temperature inside the building had dropped as the evening advanced, and the blood on the floor was beginning to congeal, darkening as it cooled. The lamps continued to burn with steady flames, their light creating pools of illumination separated by regions of shadow. In those shadows, men died with only their killers as witnesses, and the fog absorbed their final sounds and carried them nowhere. Outside, the village of Denham continued its evening routines, oblivious to the horror unfolding in its midst. Children were put to bed, fires were stoked, prayers were said. The ordinary rituals of Victorian life proceeded without interruption, without awareness that something monstrous had invaded the predictable world and transformed it into something else entirely. The fog ensured that what happened in the slaughterhouse remained contained within its stone walls. A secret that would keep until morning revealed what darkness had concealed. Chapter 8. The Discovery. The fog had not lifted by the morning, but it had thinned enough that shapes could be distinguished at a distance of several yards, and the kept village began its daily resurrection from the stillness of night. The church bells of St. Mary the Virgin rang for morning prayer at 7 o'clock, their sound carrying across the rooftops and gardens of Denham with the familiar authority that had marked the hours for centuries. Shopkeepers unlatched their doors and swept their thresholds. Farm labourers departed for the fields. Women carried water from the village pump and built up their fires for the day's cooking. It was Thursday, the 24th of November, and the world resumed its customary rhythms without knowledge that those rhythms had been shattered. Elizabeth Hartwell had not slept. She had waited through the evening for her husband and son to return, her anxiety increasing as the hours passed and the stew grew cold and the fire burned low. At midnight, she had known something was wrong, but the fog had been too thick and the hour too late for her to venture out in search of them. She had sat by the window through the long darkness, watching for movement in the street, listening for footsteps that never came. When dawn finally arrived, grey and reluctant, she wrapped herself in her shawl and left her cottage, moving toward Chapel Street with dread settling in her stomach like a stone. She was not the first to reach the slaughterhouse. That distinction belonged to a boy named Peter Graves, 13 years old, whose father had sent him to purchase meat for the midday meal. Peter had approached the building from the rear, through the yard where the livestock pen stood empty, and he had noticed immediately that the door stood open wider than was customary. He had called out a greeting, expecting one of the men to appear and attend to his request, but no one had answered. The silence had seemed strange to him, for the slaughterhouse was never entirely quiet during working hours, and curiosity had drawn him closer to the doorway. What Peter saw when he looked inside would mark him for the remainder of his life. He would speak of it only once to the constable who questioned him, and then never again, refusing even decades later to describe what his eyes had witnessed in that moment. He had turned and run, his legs carrying him back through the yard and into Chapel Street, where he collided with Elizabeth Hartwell, his face white and his mouth working soundlessly. Elizabeth had gripped his shoulders and demanded to know what had frightened him, but Peter could only point back toward the slaughterhouse, his arm trembling, his eyes wide with shock. Elizabeth had continued forward, though some part of her already knew what she would find, had known it through the long night of waiting, had felt it in the marrow of her bones. She reached the doorway and stopped, her hand rising to her mouth, her breath catching in her throat. The morning light, weak as it was, illuminated the interior of the slaughterhouse with sufficient clarity to reveal what the darkness had concealed. Bodies lay scattered across the killing floor in positions that spoke of violence and struggle and desperate flight. Blood covered the stones in quantities that seemed impossible. Great dark pools that reflected the grey sky visible through the open door. The smell was overwhelming, copper and meat and something else. Something that Elizabeth's mind refused to name but her body recognised as death. She saw Thomas first, lying on his side near the centre of the room, one arm extended as though reaching for something beyond his grasp. She saw William against the wall, his throat opened in a wound that no surgeon could repair. She saw the others, men she had known, men who had worked beside her husband, men who had families waiting for them as she had waited. And she understood in that instant that her life had ended as surely as theirs had, that she was now a widow and her children were fatherless, that the future she had imagined had been erased and replaced with something unthinkable. She did not scream. The violence of what she witnessed seemed to have stolen her voice, and she stood in silence, her hand still pressed to her mouth, her eyes moving across the scene with terrible comprehension. Behind her, Peter Graves had begun to cry, great heaving sobs that shook his thin frame. The sound seemed to break Elizabeth's paralysis, and she turned to him with instincts that were maternal despite her own devastation. She told him to run, to fetch the constable, to raise the alarm, to bring help, though she knew that help could do nothing for the men who lay dead in the slaughterhouse. Peter ran, and Elizabeth remained at the threshold, unable to enter, unable to depart, fixed in place by the enormity of what had occurred. She did not weep. She did not speak. She simply stood, a figure of grief so profound that it had no expression, while the fog swirled around her, and the morning light strengthened, and the village of Denham began to stir with the first whispers of news that would soon become a roar. The constable arrived within minutes, a man named William Perkins, who had held his position for 15 years and had never encountered anything more serious than petty theft or drunken disturbances. He was a large man, accustomed to physical confrontation, but when he entered the slaughterhouse he emerged moments later and vomited against the exterior wall, his body rejecting what his eyes had witnessed. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and ordered the growing crowd of onlookers to stand back, to disperse, to return to their homes, though no one obeyed him. The people of Denham pressed closer, driven by the morbid curiosity that attends all disasters, by the need to witness and thereby confirm the reality of something that seemed impossible. Perkins secured the scene as best he could, positioning himself at the door and refusing entry to anyone. He sent runners to the neighbouring towns, to Uxbridge and Rickmansworth, carrying messages that would summon physicians and magistrates and officers from Scotland Yard. He knew that this was beyond his capability to investigate, beyond his authority to resolve. This was murder on a scale that the village had never known, that the county had rarely seen, and it would require resources and expertise that a rural constable did not possess. By mid-morning, the slaughterhouse was surrounded by a crowd of perhaps 200 people, the entire adult population of Denham and many from the surrounding farms and settlements. They stood in silence mostly, speaking in whispers when they spoke at all, their faces grave and shocked. News had spread with the speed that tragedy always travelled, carried from house to house, from shop to field, from church to inn, until everyone knew that 7 men had been slaughtered in the building on Chapel Street, that Thomas Hartwell and his son were among the dead, that the killer had not been caught and might still be near. Fear settled over the village like a second fog. Mothers called their children inside and locked their doors. Men collected whatever weapons they possessed, farm tools and old cavalry sabres and fowling pieces that had not been fired in years. The shops closed. The forge went cold. The George Inn barred its windows. Denham transformed itself into a fortress, its people huddled behind walls and doors, waiting for an enemy they could not see and did not understand. The physicians arrived first, 2 men from Uxbridge who had been summoned to examine the bodies and determine cause of death, though such determination seemed unnecessary given the obvious evidence of violence. They entered the slaughterhouse with handkerchiefs pressed to their faces and emerged an hour later with notes that would form the basis of the inquest. They confirmed what everyone already knew. 7 men had been killed by blows from some heavy instrument, possibly an axe or cleaver, and death had come quickly for some and slowly for others. The wounds were consistent with deliberate attack rather than accident, and the quantity of blood suggested that the victims had been alive when the assault began. By afternoon, officers from Scotland Yard had arrived. 3 detectives dispatched from London with authority to investigate and apprehend the killer. They were men accustomed to the violence of the city, to murders committed for money or passion or madness, but even they were unprepared for what they found in the slaughterhouse at Denham. They walked through the building in silence, their boots leaving prints in the congealed blood, their eyes cataloguing the positions of bodies and the distribution of wounds. They took measurements and made sketches and collected what physical evidence remained after the disturbance of the scene by those who had discovered it. The senior detective, a man named Inspector Robert Crawford, emerged from the slaughterhouse. As the afternoon light began to fail and addressed the assembled crowd, he announced that a full investigation would be conducted, that every resident of Denham would be questioned, that the killer would be found and brought to justice. His voice was firm and authoritative, projecting confidence that he did not entirely feel. He had seen murders before, many of them, but this was different. This was systematic, efficient, the work of someone who had killed with purpose and without hesitation. This was not the crime of passion or panic. This was something else, something colder and more disturbing. As darkness fell on the second day, the bodies were removed from the slaughterhouse and taken to the village church where they would lie until burial could be arranged. 7 coffins were constructed in haste by the carpenter. 7 graves were dug in the churchyard by men who wept as they worked. The families of the dead gathered at St. Mary the Virgin, and their grief filled the ancient stone building with sounds that had echoed there for centuries, the timeless wailing of those who have lost what cannot be recovered. Elizabeth Hartwell sat in the front pew beside her children, dry-eyed and silent, her hands folded in her lap, her face expressionless. She had moved beyond tears, beyond speech, into some deeper territory of loss where the ordinary responses to death no longer applied. She would remain in that territory for weeks, months, perhaps forever, transformed by violence into something other than what she had been, a widow at 43 with 4 children to raise and no means of support, cast into poverty by the actions of a stranger whose name she did not know and whose face she had never seen. Chapter 9. The Inquest and the Accused. The inquest opened 3 days after the discovery of the bodies, convened in the assembly room above the George Inn, where space could accommodate the crowd that pressed to attend. A coroner had been summoned from the county seat, a man named Edmund Blackwell, who had presided over hundreds of inquests during his 20-year tenure. He was a solicitor by training, knowledgeable in the law and experienced in the examination of witnesses, but he had never conducted an inquest into circumstances quite like these. 7 deaths in a single incident was unprecedented in his experience, and the public interest was enormous, drawing newspapermen from London and curiosity seekers from across the Thames Valley. The room was filled beyond capacity, with standing room only for those who arrived after the seats were claimed. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and tobacco smoke, and the windows had been opened despite the cold to provide circulation. At the front of the room sat Blackwell, flanked by a jury of 12 men drawn from the respectable tradesmen of the area. Before them stood a series of witnesses who would provide testimony about the events of that November evening and the discovery that followed. Peter Graves was called first, and he approached the witness position with obvious reluctance, his eyes downcast, his hands clasped before him. The coroner questioned him gently, understanding that the boy had been traumatized by what he had seen, but the law required his testimony. Peter described arriving at the slaughterhouse, calling out and receiving no answer, approaching the door and looking inside. When asked to describe what he saw, he hesitated, his face paling, and finally spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. 7 men lying dead, he said. Blood everywhere, nothing moving. He had run for help, and that was all he knew. Elizabeth Hartwell was called next, and she walked to the witness position with her back straight and her head high, refusing to display the devastation that consumed her. She described waiting through the evening for her husband and son to return. her growing concern as the hours passed, her decision to search for them at dawn. She confirmed that she had seen the bodies, that she had recognised Thomas and William among the dead, that she had sent Peter to fetch the constable. The coroner asked if she knew of anyone who bore her husband ill will, anyone who might wish him harm, and she answered no without hesitation. Thomas had been well regarded, she said. He had no enemies that she knew of. He had conducted his business fairly and paid his debts and attended church and raised his family. There was no reason for anyone to kill him. Constable Perkins testified about his arrival at the scene, his examination of the bodies, his immediate dispatch of messages requesting assistance from higher authorities. He was questioned about whether anything had been disturbed before the physicians and detectives arrived, and he admitted that the scene had been compromised by those who discovered it, by himself when he first entered, and by the crowd that had gathered before he could secure the perimeter. The coroner frowned at this admission, but did not press the matter, understanding that a rural constable could not be expected to preserve evidence with the sophistication of trained investigators. The physicians presented their findings in clinical detail that seemed grotesque in its precision. They described the wounds each man had sustained, the probable sequence of injuries, the approximate time of death. Thomas Hartwell had suffered 2 blows to the head, either of which would have been fatal. William Hartwell had received a single cut to the throat that had severed the major vessels and caused death within minutes. James Morton had been stabbed twice in the chest, the blade penetrating the heart. Edward Palmer had sustained multiple injuries consistent with defensive wounds, suggesting he had tried to protect himself before succumbing. Robert Chilton had been struck in the head and torso. Henry Walsh had died from a blow to the neck. Albert Green had bled to death from a severed artery in his leg. The catalogue of injuries was received in silence by the assembled crowd, each detail adding weight to the horror of what had occurred. When the physicians concluded their testimony, the coroner called Inspector Crawford, who presented the findings of the Scotland Yard investigation. Crawford was a methodical speaker, laying out the facts in careful sequence. The slaughterhouse had been entered through the front door, which stood unlocked as was customary during working hours. The killer had moved systematically through the building, attacking each man in turn. There was no evidence of robbery, as money found on the bodies and in the cash box remained undisturbed. There was no evidence of any struggle outside the building or any indication that the killer had been injured during the attack. Crawford then addressed the question that was foremost in everyone's mind: who had committed these murders? The investigation had identified a suspect, he announced, a man named Daniel Fletcher, who had been employed at the slaughterhouse until 3 weeks earlier, when he had been dismissed by Thomas Hartwell for drunkenness and unreliability. Fletcher had been seen in the vicinity of Chapel Street on the evening of the murders, and he had disappeared from his lodgings immediately afterward. A warrant had been issued for his arrest, and officers were searching for him throughout the county and beyond. The revelation that a suspect had been identified caused a stir in the assembly room, with people leaning toward one another to exchange whispered comments. The coroner called for order and then questioned Crawford about the evidence linking Fletcher to the crimes. Crawford explained that Fletcher had been heard making threats against Thomas Hartwell, saying that he would make him pay for the dismissal. Fletcher had a history of violence, having been convicted of assault 5 years earlier. He had been seen near the slaughterhouse around 6 o'clock on the evening in question, though no one could definitively place him inside the building. His sudden disappearance was itself suspicious, suggesting consciousness of guilt. The coroner asked whether any physical evidence connected Fletcher to the murders, and Crawford admitted that no such evidence had been recovered. No weapon had been found. No blood-stained clothing had been discovered. No witnesses had seen Fletcher entering or leaving the slaughterhouse. The case against him was circumstantial but compelling. Motive, opportunity, and flight from justice. Crawford expressed confidence that Fletcher would be apprehended and brought to trial, where a jury could weigh the evidence and determine guilt or innocence. The inquest continued through the afternoon, with additional witnesses called to testify about their knowledge of the victim, the operation of the slaughterhouse, and the events of that November evening. No one had seen or heard anything that provided direct evidence of the killer's identity. The fog had concealed his approach and departure. The stone walls of the building had muffled the sounds of violence. The victims had been isolated in their workplace, with no one near enough to witness their deaths or come to their aid. As the light faded and lamps were lit in the assembly room, the coroner addressed the jury and instructed them on their duty. They were to determine the cause of death for each of the 7 men, and, if possible, identify who had killed them. The jury retired to deliberate, and they returned within 20 minutes with their verdict. Thomas Hartwell, William Hartwell, James Morton, Edward Palmer, Robert Chilton, Henry Walsh, and Albert Green had been murdered by person or persons unknown. The verdict was not unexpected, but it was received with disappointment by the crowd, who had hoped for more definitive answers. The coroner thanked the jury and declared the inquest concluded. He expressed his condolences to the families of the deceased and his hope that the investigation would soon result in the apprehension and conviction of the guilty party. The crowd filed out of the assembly room into the cold evening, their conversation subdued, their faces troubled. The inquest had provided answers to some questions, but had left the most important question unanswered. Who had killed 7 men in the slaughterhouse on Chapel Street, and why? In the days that followed, the search for Daniel Fletcher intensified. His description was circulated to every constabulary in England. Rewards were offered for information leading to his capture. Sightings were reported from a dozen different locations, but none proved credible. Fletcher had vanished as completely as if he had never existed, and the mystery of his whereabouts deepened with each passing week. Some believed he had fled to London, where a man could disappear into the crowded anonymity of the metropolis. Others thought he had left England entirely, perhaps sailing to America or Australia where British justice could not reach. A few whispered that he had never been the killer at all, that Scotland Yard had fixed upon him as a convenient suspect to satisfy public demand for resolution, and that the true murderer remained free and might strike again. The Denham Massacre, as the newspapers had begun calling it, became a sensation throughout England. Articles appeared in the Times and the Illustrated London News, describing the murders in lurid detail and speculating about the motives and identity of the killer. The story had everything that captured Victorian imagination: violence, mystery, innocent victims, and a faceless villain who had escaped justice. For weeks it had dominated conversation in parlours and public houses, providing material for sermons about the decline of morality, and fodder for those who argued that capital punishment should be more swiftly and widely applied. But as winter deepened and no arrest was made, public interest gradually waned. Other crimes occurred, other scandals emerged, and the Denham Massacre receded from the front pages to the inside columns, and finally disappeared from the newspapers altogether. The village returned to its routines, though altered by loss and haunted by memory. The slaughterhouse on Chapel Street remained closed, its doors locked, its interior unchanged from the morning of discovery. No one wished to enter it, to work where 7 men had died, to walk across stones stained with their blood. Chapter 10. The Shadow That Lingered. The years that followed the Denham Massacre brought changes to the village, some subtle and some profound, all shaped in ways both visible and invisible by the events of that November night. Elizabeth Hartwell and her children survived on charity from the parish, and what small income she could earn taking in washing and mending. She never remarried, never spoke her husband's name except when necessity required it, and carried her grief like a physical weight that bayed her shoulders and greyed her hair before its time. She lived another 23 years, dying in 1893 at the age of 66, and when they buried her beside Thomas in the churchyard of St Mary the Virgin, those who attended the funeral said that death had finally released her from a prison she had inhabited since the morning she stood at the threshold of the slaughterhouse and saw what could not be unseen. The other widows and families of the dead men suffered similarly. Mary Palmer never recovered from the loss of her son Edward, and she retreated into silence and isolation, living alone in her cottage in Ivers until her death 5 years after the massacre. The Mortons, the Chiltons, the Walshes, the Greens, each family carried their loss forward into time, and the absence of their dead marked every gathering, every celebration, every ordinary moment that should have included them but did not. Daniel Fletcher was never found. Despite extensive searches and numerous reported sightings, he disappeared so completely that some began to question whether he had ever existed at all, whether the name was simply a convenience that allowed Scotland Yard to close their investigation without admitting failure. The case remained officially open, and for years afterward, detectives would occasionally pursue new leads or investigate claims that Fletcher had been seen in some distant location. But no arrest was ever made, no trial ever conducted, no justice ever dispensed for the 7 men who died in the slaughterhouse. The building itself stood empty for 3 years, deteriorating from neglect and weather. The roof leaked, the doors sagged on their hinges. Children whispered that it was haunted, that the ghosts of the murdered men walked the killing floor at night, and no child would approach it after dark, no matter what dares were issued or what taunts were spoken. Adults avoided it as well, crossing to the opposite side of Chapel Street rather than pass too near, as though the violence that had occurred within its walls might somehow leak out and contaminate those who came too close. In 1873, a businessman from London purchased the property with plans to demolish the building and construct a row of shops, but the local population objected so strenuously that he abandoned the project. The slaughterhouse remained standing, a monument to tragedy, slowly decaying into ruin. Vagrants sometimes sheltered there, and occasionally the constable would have to evict them. But otherwise it stood empty and unused, a wound in the heart of the village that would not heal. The economic impact of the massacre extended beyond the immediate loss of 7 workers. The slaughtering trade in Denham never recovered. Other men attempted to establish businesses, but none lasted more than a few months. Farmers took their livestock to Uxbridge or Rickmansworth, and the butchers of Denham purchased their meat from suppliers in neighbouring towns. The local economy suffered, and families who had been prosperous fell into poverty, unable to find work or maintain their businesses without the commerce that the slaughterhouse had generated. The psychological impact was perhaps even more significant. Trust eroded in ways that were difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. Neighbours regarded one another with suspicion, wondering if the killer might be among them, living in plain sight, concealing his guilt behind a facade of normalcy. Strangers were viewed with alarm, and travellers who stopped in Denham found the village unwelcoming, its people withdrawn and guarded. The openness that had characterised rural English life, the casual intimacy of small communities where everyone knew everyone, gave way to wariness and isolation. The church attempted to provide comfort and meaning in the face of inexplicable violence. Reverend Whitfield preached sermons about suffering and faith, about Job and his trials, about the inscrutability of divine will. But his words seemed inadequate to the enormity of what had occurred, and attendance at services declined as people struggled with the failure of religion to prevent or explain the massacre. Some turned away from faith entirely, unable to reconcile a benevolent God with the brutal deaths of innocent men. Others clung more tightly to belief, finding in it the only possible source of consolation in a world that had revealed itself as fundamentally dangerous and unjust. The Denham Massacre entered into local folklore, becoming one of those events that defined a place and its people. Children born years after the murders grew up hearing the story, and they would pass it on to their children in turn. The details became embellished over time, acquiring elements of legend and myth that obscured the historical facts. Some versions claimed that the killer had been a demon or supernatural entity. Others insisted that the murders had been part of a conspiracy involving powerful men who had silenced witnesses to their crimes. The truth became impossible to separate from fiction, and perhaps it no longer mattered, for what remained consistent across all versions was the essential horror of 7 men killed without mercy or explanation. By the turn of the century, most of those who had lived through the massacre had died, and Denham began to shed its association with tragedy. New families moved in, unaware of or unconcerned by the history. The slaughterhouse was finally demolished in 1902, and the land was sold and divided and built upon. Houses now stand where men once died. and those who live in them may have no knowledge of what occurred beneath their foundations. The village modernised, connected to the railway network, grew in size and prosperity, became part of the greater London metropolitan area. But the memory persisted, recorded in parish registers and newspaper archives, in the journals of those who investigated the crimes, in the correspondence of families torn apart by loss. St. Mary the Virgin still stands, and in its churchyard are 7 graves marked with simple stones that bear the names of Thomas Hartwell, William Hartwell, James Morton, Edward Palmer, Robert Chilton, Henry Walsh, and Albert Green. The inscriptions note only their names and dates, offering no explanation of how they died or why, as though such explanation is impossible or inappropriate for the sacred ground where they rest. The question of why the massacre occurred was never satisfactorily answered. Theories proliferated. Revenge for some slight or injury, madness, a robbery gone terribly wrong, a ritualistic killing. Each theory had its proponents, but none explained all the facts, and none brought peace to those who sought understanding. Perhaps there was no understanding to be had, no rational explanation for irrational violence, no meaning to be extracted from meaningless death. What can be said with certainty is that 7 men went to work on a November evening in 1870, expecting to complete their tasks and return to their homes and families, and they never did. Their lives were cut short by violence that descended upon them without warning, and the ripples of that violence spread outward through time and space, touching hundreds of lives, altering the character of a community, adding another chapter to the long history of human cruelty and suffering. The slaughterhouse on Chapel Street is gone now. The men who died there are gone. The witnesses and investigators and those who mourned are all gone, claimed by time if not by violence. But the story remains, preserved in the written record, in the collective memory of those who trace their heritage to Denham, and in the simple fact that once, in the fog and darkness of a Victorian November, something terrible happened in a small English village, and the shadow it cast has not entirely lifted even now, more than a century and a half later. The candles have all burned low. The hall is silent. The rain has stopped, and the fog has cleared, but the darkness remains, as it always does, waiting just beyond the reach of our lights, reminding us that we are never as safe as we believe, that the familiar can transform into the terrible without warning, and that history, once written in blood, never truly fades. And so we close this chronicle and extinguish the lamps, and we carry with us into sleep the knowledge of what occurred in Denham, not as entertainment or sensation, but as testimony to those who suffered and died, and as a reminder that beneath the surface of ordinary life, darkness always waits, patient and persistent, for the moment when it can emerge and claim what it will. Good night. Rest well, and remember those who could not.